Hi, this is Felix Knight. First devlog for my climate game. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be called because I basically just started it this week. I've only worked on it for like 3 hours total. If you watched my last devlog series, Hyperham, I started that probably about 2/3 of the way into developing the game. So I already had a bunch of stuff going on, and I was just kind of wrapping things up by the time I started doing video for that. But it really just helped me kind of like work out stuff that I was thinking about to be able to video it and talk about it. And it also just was kind of a fun, exciting thing to get to do each week. It kind of kept me motivated to keep working on the game. So I decided to do that for this project. And I actually my semester just started, so I'm doing it from the very, very beginning. So a little bit of background about this project. It's an independent study. I had to design it. I had to basically pitch the entirety of the class, aside from kind of the grading structure. My instructor set that up for me. But I decided I wanted to make a game. After DigiPen, I would really like to work in something that allows me to work on reversing climate change. And I figured while I was here, I try to make a game that somehow measurably impacts climate change. So ideally, when people finish it, when they come away from it, they do something to reduce climate change, or something that I can measure, something that they can do. But I also, I don't just want it to be like a sort of an edutainment, I don't know. I feel like a lot of the games that kind of try to deal with a more a particular issue or try to push a certain agenda, which I would say I am. My agenda is trying to reduce climate change. I think it's a laudable thing to do. But those, I think, a lot of the time end up feeling a little bit. It's not even just that they're heavy-handed. It's just that they don't really feel like a game. Like, it's not a entertainment, or it's not like an engaging experience. It's not about having an engaging experience. It's about trying to just tell somebody to go do this thing afterwards or whatever. But I think having an engaging experience would be super powerful and like way more moving for people who want to push them to act. So that's the goal of the game is. Right now, I have very little idea of what the actual game is going to do, just its goal. These first few weeks, I'm basically just researching, understanding the problem better. Because I've read a number of. I read a book on zoology and biodiversity that talked about. It was specifically about climate change with regards to those things. This is something that interests me and that I have sort of cursory knowledge of. It's this like, we're all gonna die at some point, but I need to know exactly why. What is going to get us to this point? So the first week, I just wanted to figure out and get good notes and write a kind of a more structured paper. These are just notes right now, but they're about causes and effects of climate change. I started to get a little bit into solutions because I wanted to see what I could get from this Project Drawdown, which is a whole list of basically 100 really projected to be like very effective solutions for reducing climate change and getting us to a point where we reach drawdown, which is the point where we're actually removing more greenhouse gases from the atmosphere than we are putting into it. Which by another project, I think it's, what is it called? Somewhere in here, there's a, I don't want to find this, but there's another sort of group or project or something that explains that we need to reach, here it is, exponential roadmap. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. By 2030, so you have 10 years to do that, and then you have another 20 years after that, 2050, to reduce them completely to 0%, to actually reach that point of drawdown, in order to avoid significant societal disaster. Basically, yeah, downfall of humanity, I guess, that kind of deal. Yeah, so I'm basically just collecting more of this data, and I figure the main things that I've found so far are transport and electricity. At least in the United States, use a ton of electricity. But what you might not expect is, this is probably a little bit small, maybe a little hard to read, but agriculture here accounts for 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions, which is a lot in its own, but it doesn't seem as bad as the 30% that comes from transport or whatever. But when you look at that Project Drawdown, the top solution is reducing food waste. And so that seems kind of strange, but it makes sense because a lot of this food waste ends up happening, especially in richer countries like in the United States. It's not happening at the source where it's not farmers losing a huge portion of their crop or whatever. It is very late in the supply chain once you've packaged the food and processed it and delivered it to a store or something like that, and then they can't sell all their stock and they just end up trashing it. All of the extra steps in between of packaging, processing, transport, that all creates greenhouse gases that essentially, because the food perishes, you can't do anything with it. You can't do anything with the, how you transport it. It is waste. Everything that went into it basically just gets wasted for nothing. So that is, I think we throw away in the United States like a third of our food or something like that. A third of it gets wasted, never used. So reducing that would be huge for our greenhouse gas emissions. There's some more in here. Honestly, it's been a few days since I looked at it, but things like our greenhouse gas emissions in terms of like by country, per capita, looking at those things in combination gives you a better understanding of how this stuff works. And then I had some idea of the different effects, and I went and looked at those in more detail, and I think I'll probably do a little bit more looking at the effects, and then I kind of figure out where I go from there. So I think the next thing I want to look at, and I actually read a book on this, but it was in high school, like I mentioned, this book called Where the Wild Things Were, which has kind of a silly title, but it's an excellent book that explains how climate change has influenced all these different ecosystems, and it walks through like 4 or 5 of them. Here's specifically where one, what are generally called a keystone species, where pretty much everything in this ecosystem relies on that species existing and functioning in a certain way. There are some species that are going to be more or less important to the overall functioning of an ecosystem. The problem is when you have a keystone species that you end up having some effect of climate change or whatever, but in a lot of these cases climate change is massive, right? That ends up killing or significantly reducing the population of that species, and it just throws the entire ecosystem out of whack. So even all these other things that could have been resilient to the climate factors because they rely on this one animal or plant that wasn't resistant to that, they all end up suffering as a result. And that's stuff that I know, but I want to go back and find some good source online to get some quick just facts and stuff like that I can kind of present in a bigger paper. So I'm going to go look at that a little bit more. So I got a little bit of information on biodiversity. I had heard of coral bleaching before, but I wasn't sure exactly what that was. So that is with increased temperature and pollution in the water, coral loses this algae called this, I have no idea how to pronounce that, but that provides them nutrients. So it seems like they have a higher likelihood to die, higher mortality with that increased temperature and pollution. Changes migrational patterns. This is interesting too. So plants require carbon dioxide in order to photosynthesize, and so it actually kind of works in their favor. Like the increased carbon in the atmosphere almost kind of works in their favor. However, it changes the nutritional value of those plants actually. which the page that I was looking at, this page from Australia's, I think this is Australian Academy of Science, was saying that it could do harm to animals like koalas that rely on eating leafy plants. But what it didn't mention there that I would be interested to know, and I don't know if I'll be able to find info on this, is if that would affect us as well, or if it's just certain animals maybe that eat specific plants. It was actually kind of hard to find, like, at least from a few seconds of Googling, it didn't really look like anything was coming up about the keystone species being affected by climate change. But I just linked this book that I had read. This page outlines this is why keystone species are important. Everything in a ecosystem can rely on them to a large extent. And I just said, look, here you can see how climate change can affect all of these different types of species. If one of them happens to be a keystone species, you're much more likely to throw the entire ecosystem out of whack. And part of the problem with this, and that this page discusses it, is especially what can happen is you can remove one population that keeps another number of populations in check. So if you remove a predator, for instance, now all of the producers in the ecosystem, the things that are lower in the chain, have less pressure from predation. And you can see that in the United States, where we've removed all of these wolves from ecosystems because we don't want them in towns, we don't want them in human spaces, right? But the problem with that is that now we have these massive deer populations. So before, 100 years ago or whatever, I don't think deer were as big of an issue in public spaces or whatever, but now they're everywhere. And it's like, if you live in the East Coast, for instance, hitting deer with your car on accident is like a super common thing. But it indicates it's a really big issue, because then those deer end up eating too many of the plants, or they end up pushing out all of these other things. And so you end up with an ecosystem that used to be really diverse and have all of these different moving parts, which actually makes it more stable. And now it's all just relying on deer or something. And if that thing falls, then you're screwed. Or even worse, that one predominant species can actually end up just wrecking everything ecologically if it's allowed to get kind of out of hand. It's like invasive species, right? In ocean acidification, so carbon dioxide makes the ocean more acidic. I didn't know this. It makes it harder for water animals, shellfish, things like that, to grow shells, which can lead to them being vulnerable and more likely to get killed by predators, I would imagine. Which also is bad for people like me that like eating crab and lobster and things like that. Means that they'll be more of a commodity in the future. I have a bunch of these things, and while I was doing that one, I was thinking about, I've heard these estimates, and the one page, I've already forgotten. Exponential roadmap mentioned by 2050 we could face extreme societal collapse. What does that mean? Obviously, kind of all of these things in combination, like you have massive amounts of people getting forced out of their homes for these reasons and stuff. But I would be interested to see, so I'm going to look around and see if there's anything that kind of like, it's like, here's a glance at what everyday life could sort of be like, or what the entire sort of world landscape could look like, sort of in a nutshell, everything in combination, in literally like 30 years if we don't do something about this. And here you go. Time isn't necessarily my favorite news source, but what will the world look like in 2015 if we don't? So this is interesting. I haven't actually started reading this, but it was just like a first glance. It says in 2050, if we don't cut carbon emissions in half, which is strange. I mean, I know that there are going to be competing sources and ideas on this. Exponential roadmap says we need to be at 50% by 2030. And this was from the last couple of years, so clearly they have the information. But net zero by 2050. And this is interesting. I have a feeling that, and I'm going a little bit in depth in these things, but I figured probably explaining this is like more valuable or more interesting than me just being like, I'm going to go research this. No, I'm going to go research this. Like, try to give some detail. would imagine that that first 50% in the next 10 years is probably going to be kind of, they're expecting those to be easier reductions to make. And then the other 50%, like all of the rest of our emissions, get a 20-year time box to fix, because I'm guessing that's going to be the part where like, oh, now we really actually have to start making some hard sacrifices and decisions and things like that. Just funny, because I mean, we're not reducing our emissions as far as I'm aware. They have steadily continued to increase for years. That's probably also another good thing to look at. But yeah, even that first 50% in 10 years, like that seems like a huge goal. But the second 50% in the next 20 after that, I feel like it's going to be huge. I'm going to take a look at this and see what Time has to say. I had dinner and was away for a little bit. But I went through that article, the Time article, and it was actually really interesting because, I mean, it still just kind of goes through things bullet point by bullet point, but I mean, in terms of, it looked like there's an actual book that describes these things more in depth, as well as like, here's what an alternate sort of future looks like if we reduce our emissions. But it just kind of goes point by point. Here's what's going to happen to the air. The air is going to get hotter. It's going to become more difficult to breathe. The heating at that point will be irreversible. They pretty much said at that point, like, humanity will be like, we will have inevitable downfall at some point. And a huge issue, it sounds like, will be public health, because people won't be able to stand the news, which I really identify with right now. Obviously, with the crisis that we're going through with coronavirus, it's like paying attention to the news sometimes right now can feel hard. Imagine in a few decades, like within my lifetime and probably the lifetime of most people watching this, like it won't be possible to pay attention to those things, because it's going to be so mentally demanding and upsetting and depressing. And a lot of people would end up committing suicide from that feeling of, and seeing that like inevitable death of our species basically playing out. Water shortages, issues with redistribution. I thought that was interesting because that's something that we're actually going through right now. I know California is starting to become really concerned about the limitations of their water supply. This is an interesting one. Permafrost. When permafrost melts, it contains greenhouse gases those are going to get released and actually accelerate the process of climate change. And also, this point that they brought up, permafrost will have ancient microbes in it that will then be released, and it's said could wreak havoc on humans in terms of new diseases. But I imagine that could also be really, really devastating to other species as well. Where storms, farming becomes pretty much impossible, things like that. Another thing I wanted to have in here was the accuracy of predictions, right? So I think that is one thing that just, especially, I read a book over the summer called Losing Earth, and this was earlier on in the discussion about climate change, at least in the United States government, and a lot of people, even scientists, people who have a background in this stuff, whenever these projections were being made and predictions being made, they were like, well, to what degree of certainty do we know that like we need to reduce our emissions by this much, or this thing is going to happen? Like, you can predict all this stuff, but like maybe our computer models aren't up to snuff and we're not sure. So, and I think that's probably a common for people that maybe not climate change deniers, but maybe people who aren't exactly sure, or if they hear that, like, the statement of like, oh, by 2050 the sun is going to set us all on fire and we're all going to die, and think like, okay, really, 2050, come on, that's 30 years down the road. Like, our predictions, this was starting from 2004, so the early 2000s, we have pretty darn accurate predictions. So we should, and our models are only getting more sophisticated, more accurate. they only have reason to get more sophisticated, more accurate. So if we're basing off those models and we're saying, well, according to our current models, if we don't reduce our emissions by this amount, these are all the things that are going to happen, and we're already starting to see them on a smaller scale. We just are saying, well, scale that up. Now we're going to be running out of water in all these different places, and now we're going to have massive amounts of disease and things like that. We're already starting to see it. We are pretty sure that it's going to continue to follow this pattern. We basically have overwhelming evidence, and it seems to me that things are going to continue to go the way that we've predicted. So it seems extremely inarguable to me that this isn't going to affect us within the next few decades, and it might not. That it may be really, really critical for us in the next few decades. So I think that was most of what I wanted to get through. Oh, I would like to. This page was really interesting. It showed a breakdown of how many tons of carbon. But if you just look at it like per country, for instance, it's a little bit misleading because China has a massive amount of emissions, which is true. It does have a massive amount of emissions, but per capita, like the United States is technically worse. Like China is still a significant contributor to pollution, but if you're looking at things in terms of per capita, the United States, and I didn't expect Canada also, but Canada is apparently really bad. Australia, Russia, and a couple of these South Asian countries. So, or I guess Northern Asian countries. Sorry, Central Asia. Asia's really large, all right? That's the point. So what I would like to do is get more information specifically on, and I think that the ones where it breaks down by sector, this here, emissions by sector, I think that might be for the United States. I want to look, but I want to make sure that I have a good understanding. Even if, and I expect the game to be more targeted towards people in the United States, since that's just straight up who's going to look at the Digipen game gallery, and also I don't have the time to localize it for a bunch of other languages or places. But I would still like to have at least the understanding of how this is working, playing out on a global scale. So I want to get some more information there. So this is quick, but yeah, this world and data emissions by sector, it is set global sectors, and those are, you can see in this chart, it's primarily energy production, and a lot of that is transport, industry, things like that, and you get down into your agriculture and waste. I think I want to get a little, I still feel like there's probably more here that I would like to see. But another thing, I don't want to get too into the solutions because that's something that I'm going to focus on next week. But I think I could get a jump and at least make sure, I want to make sure that whatever I'm looking at is positioning itself in terms of a global strategy. Because it's not just the US that needs to reduce their emissions. It's basically every country on the face of the planet. So I'm gonna look through these and make sure that they're kind of like focused on the entire planet, and we'll go from there. Now that I'm looking through these more, I kind of went through the causes and effects, specifically in terms of what were the questions that I had immediately, things that I had some understanding of but wanted to understand better, and things like that. And I think my section here on effects has a lot of data. There's probably more like specific things that I want to talk about with regards to causes, but I think I will probably end up using the same sources and just getting data and notes from there. But I feel like at this point that's pretty complete, and I need to write an actual kind of like paper that covers those things. I think it's probably like I need to do more work for this week, but I think I have a lot of data and I have a lot of the information that I was looking for there. So I'm going to go ahead and actually write that out as like a nicely formatted paper that goes through these things. And I might get a kind of a head start on my next sprint's work, which will actually be looking through these solutions. So I really think that's where I'm going to end up running into more difficulties, is trying to think about what is some way that I can actually start incorporating these things. So I think, let me see here. This is a little bit frustrating about Hack and Plan. It's kind of hard to find the board descriptions. But yeah, I need to have a game pitch that includes some sort of incorporation of a strategy or multiple strategies that I find. Originally, I was thinking I wrote this out as a summary of strategies. I didn't know that Project Drawdown already had such an excellent, like, here's what the best strategies are and here's how much they'll cost to implement and all that stuff. Like, it's just like there's a lot of information about it. Like, every single one of these has a more technical description of exactly what the solution is that they're describing, that isolated solution. But it's organized in a way that's just like very easy to look at and understand each individual part, at least on a service level. So I don't know if I'm actually going to do that. I might kind of negotiate that with my professor and just say, hey, I don't know how useful this would actually be since the information already exists. It might just end up focusing on figuring out which strategies I want to use and focusing on the game pitch next week. But I might get kind of a head start on that since I feel like I have a lot of the information that I want for this week 1 doc. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and write that up. I completely forgot to record for a little while there, but I started on the document earlier today, like my final paper for this week, just describing causes and effects. There was one other thing last night that I did more research on that I hadn't mentioned before, and that was, what was it? Essentially, I wanted to understand, like, why aren't we on track right now to reach the 1.5 degree warming target, the halved emissions by 2030. Essentially, I found a couple of Forbes articles by this professor that essentially say we would need to, in order to hit net zero by 2050, he said, assuming that our energy consumption continues to increase, we would have to create a new a new nuclear plant every day for the next 30 years and retire all of the old carbon producing means of energy production in order to meet that net zero target. And that's net zero by 2050. In order to hit a 50% reduction by 2030, you would have to go even faster than that. You have to remember, we've been building when I started thinking about it in this way, it all started to kind of click. It's not like we need to go out and build more solar panels or wind turbines or whatever. I mean, obviously we do need to do those things, but the simplifying the solution down to that doesn't make any sense, because we've been building a global energy production machine for literally hundreds of years, since the Industrial Revolution starting in the 1700s. And now we have to basically undo all of it and replace it in 30 years. Like, I mean, we have to replace 50% of it in the next 10 years in order to hit that 2030 measure. So thinking in those terms, actually the US is producing considerably more. I can't remember if that paper said it was US or global, but we are starting to produce, it was around a third of our new energy production is coming from clean sources, non-carbon emitting sources. But that's it. It's still, we need to be making that kind of energy 10 to 15 times more each year. We need to be creating those energy sources at 10 to 15 times the volume that we are currently in order to replace our global energy supply that fast. And the thing that is difficult to think about as well, but when we think about that energy consumption, and it's like, at an individual level, you might be told, like, turn off the lights, or try not to drive or use your vehicle as much or whatever. And those are all good things to do. But a large chunk of the world, many African countries are not industrialized yet. They're not running businesses and things in the same way that we are. They need power, they need energy in order for their economies to work, so that they don't have to literally just live off of agriculture and traveling by foot, however many miles a day in order to get water and necessities and things like that. That would help those countries so much. So there's still a vast increasing demand, and the world population continues to increase as well. So there is an increasing demand for energy, and we're only really outputting so much of the clean energy at once. So essentially, mathematically, it hardly makes any sense. And I guess I'll get it more into the solution stuff tomorrow. And maybe when I start looking at those, I'll start seeing like, oh, maybe there's some way that we can significantly, I would imagine the food waste would considerably cut a huge chunk of our energy consumption. I don't know if all of these solutions in tandem or whatever would get our energy consumption down low enough that we lower total global energy consumption per year or whatever. But yeah, numbers wise, it is definitely not favorable. And that article was basically saying it's not even really possible. We just have too high of an energy consumption. Too much of it is carbon based, and there's no way that we could possibly convert it all to clean energy that quickly. If there is, what it seems like to me is that pretty much the only way to like save ourselves from certain societal collapse at this point is just complete social upheaval. I would imagine that some amount of United States government forcing people to work in clean energy, and the workforce required in order to actually create all of this infrastructure is just going to be absolutely incredible. So yeah, if we manage to actually start implementing these solutions, society is not going to look the same at all. So I'm relatively close. There's still a fair bit of this paper that I need to do, but I'm going to go ahead and finish that up, and that's probably the end of this devlog. So next week, like I said, I'll be going into the actual solutions. I'll be looking at Project Drawdown a lot. Probably also Exponential Roadmap, because theirs is more tailored to businesses and how they can reduce their energy consumption, which I think would be interesting to look at. So I'm going to look at those, and also I'll be starting to think about how am I actually going to implement one of these solutions, or get the game to get people to contribute to one of those solutions or multiple of those solutions. So we really start thinking about how the game is actually going to interact with this problem. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.